Restoring democracy after an impeachment. The aftermath of removing an authoritarian leader. Impeachment is one of the most powerful constitutional tools for holding a corrupt or authoritarian president accountable. But removing a leader and their co-conspirators is only the first step in repairing a democracy that has been severely compromised. When an entire administration, along with its oligarchic backers, has manipulated institutions, rewritten laws, and consolidated power, restoring democratic governance is a complex and difficult process. This article explores what happens after an impeachment and removal, the challenges of rebuilding a democratic government, and the necessary steps to ensure that authoritarian forces do not rise again. The immediate aftermath of impeachment and removal. When a corrupt or authoritarian president is successfully impeached and removed, the transition of power depends on how deep the corruption has spread. If an entire administration was involved in subverting democracy, multiple officials, potentially including the vice president, cabinet members, and key government agency leaders, would also need to be removed or prosecuted. Who takes over after an impeachment? 1. The vice president. If uncompromised, under normal circumstances, the vice president would take over. 1. However, if they were complicit in the corruption, they could also be removed or forced to resign. 2. The Speaker of the House. If both the president and vice president are removed, the Speaker of the House assumes power under the Presidential Succession Act. 3. A temporary transitional government. In extreme cases where an entire administration has been compromised, Congress or the Supreme Court may intervene to establish an emergency transitional government until new elections can be held. Potential scenarios following removal. Checkmark. Peaceful transfer of power. If institutions still function, a new leader takes office and begins restoring democratic norms. Warning. Political chaos and resistance. If the removed leader's loyalists refuse to accept the decision, protests, legal challenges, or even violent resistance could erupt. Crossmark. Military or civilian uprising. In extreme cases, a power vacuum could lead to an attempt by factions within the military or private militias to seize control. Rebuilding government institutions after an authoritarian regime. Even after a leader and their conspirators are removed, a compromised government cannot simply return to business as usual. The legal system, electoral process, and governmental agencies must be purged of corruption and rebuilt to prevent future abuses. 1. Restoring trust in the rule of law. 1. Prosecute those responsible. High-level officials and oligarchic enablers must face legal consequences to deter future corruption. 2. Investigate corruption. A bipartisan commission or independent investigation should document abuses of power and recommend systemic reforms. 3. Strengthen whistleblower protections. Government employees and citizens must feel safe exposing future corruption. Example. After Nixon resigned due to the Watergate scandal, Congress passed new laws limiting presidential powers and increasing transparency. 2. Holding new, fair elections. If a corrupt government manipulated the electoral process, new elections may be necessary to restore legitimacy. However, ensuring fair elections requires 1. Eliminating gerrymandering and voter suppression tactics. 2. Investigating foreign interference. 3. Restoring independent oversight of elections. 4. Implementing strict campaign finance reforms to prevent billionaires from buying elections. Example. After the fall of military dictatorship in Latin America, many countries implemented electoral reforms to prevent future autocratic takeovers. 3. Breaking up oligarchic power structures. If billionaires and corporate elites were deeply involved in subverting democracy, economic reforms are necessary to prevent them from regaining control. 1. Enforce antitrust laws. Break up monopolies that were used to manipulate the economy and media. 2. End dark money in politics. Ban corporate donations and require transparency in campaign financing. 3. Tax ultra-wealthy elites who funded corruption. Implement wealth taxes to redistribute power and prevent oligarchs from buying influence again. Example. After the fall of Italy's fascist government, anti-monopoly laws were strengthened to prevent corporations from wielding unchecked political power. 4. Restoring a free and independent press. An authoritarian regime often silences the press, making media reform a key part of rebuilding democracy. 1. Reinstate independent journalism protections. 2. Break up media conglomerates owned by oligarchs. 3. Ensure social media platforms cannot be used to suppress dissent. Example: after the fall of apartheid in South Africa, media laws were rewritten to ensure free press protections. Preventing a future authoritarian takeover. Even after a corrupt regime is removed, the conditions that allowed it to rise must be addressed. Otherwise, history will repeat itself. 1. Strengthen checks and balances. 1. Limit executive power. Laws should restrict presidential authority to prevent overreach. 2. Ensure congressional oversight. A compromised legislature cannot allow presidents to act unchecked. 3. Appoint independent judges. The judiciary must be free from political influence. 2. Rebuild civic engagement and public trust. 1. Increase education on democracy. Schools should teach the importance of democratic institutions. 2. Encourage public participation in governance. Citizens should have a direct voice in shaping policy. 3. Combat disinformation. Fact-checking initiatives must be strengthened to counter propaganda. 3. Reform the military and law enforcement. 1. Purge corrupt officials. Police and military leaders who supported authoritarian rule should be removed. 2. Reinforce civilian control of the military. The armed forces must always serve the Constitution, not a political leader. 3. End the militarization of law enforcement. Police forces should focus on protecting citizens, not suppressing dissent. Final thoughts. The path to true democracy. Impeachment and removal of an authoritarian president are not the end of the battle. They're the beginning of the struggle to rebuild a fair and just society. Without real systemic change, the same forces that enabled corruption will regroup and attempt to regain power. Restoring democracy requires accountability, reform, and public vigilance. It demands that citizens stay engaged, fight for transparency, and refuse to allow wealth and power to dictate the future of their nation. The battle for democracy never truly ends. It is a constant effort to ensure that power remains in the hands of the people, not the few. This concludes this article in our investigative series, but the fight for truth continues. More stories are coming soon. Make sure to subscribe or follow to stay updated on the latest news, analysis, and insights into the forces shaping our world.